It was a mild summer day in 1938 in the heart of China, and on the surface, life seemed as normal as ever at the secretive Unit 731 complex. The sun was slowly setting, casting golden hues across the landscape. Professors, scientists, and military doctors, exhausted from a long day of research, were enjoying themselves, sipping beer by the facility's pool. Nearby, children laughed as they played tug-of-war, their innocence blissfully unaware of the shadows lurking just beyond the gates. But behind the walls of Unit 731, there were no sunsets for the prisoners, no golden light, no laughter. In the barracks next door, thousands of captives existed in a perpetual cycle of terror, with no sense of day or night, past or future. These men, women, and even children knew one thing with absolute certainty: a cruel and horrific death awaited them. The rise of a radicalizing Japan. Almost 2 decades had passed since the end of World War I, a conflict that claimed the lives of 17 million people and left nations reeling. In the aftermath, Japan, aligned with the victorious Allies, experienced an economic boom and emerged as a global power. Under Emperor Hirohito's leadership, Japan joined the League of Nations, standing among the world's foremost nations in arms control and disarmament negotiations. They were seen as peacekeepers, intent on avoiding the horrors of biological warfare that had haunted the Great War. But amidst the diplomatic handshakes and treaties aimed at peace, something far darker was brewing in the shadows of Japan's military ranks. Far from the polished halls of the League of Nations, a young, ambitious military doctor named Ishii Shiro read the international treaties with a very different perspective. While the world saw the prohibition of biological weapons as a way to avoid another human catastrophe, Ishii saw it as confirmation that these weapons held unimaginable power. The mere mention of biological warfare terrified the world, so how effective would these weapons be in the hands of those bold enough to use them? The birth of a monster, Ishii's ambition, unleashed. Ishii Shiro was no ordinary doctor. Known for his intelligence and brilliance, many regarded him as a genius. But beneath his sharp mind was a man who craved power, recognition, and control. His arrogance knew no bounds, and his ambition blinded him to morality. He saw himself as a trailblazer, someone destined to advance Japan's military might through unconventional means. In 1928, Ishii embarked on a 2-year world tour under the guise of academic research. He claimed to study international efforts related to biological weapons, but in truth, he was gathering intelligence and fueling his own twisted ambitions. By the time he returned to Japan in 1930, the global economic crisis had begun to take its toll. The political landscape in Japan was shifting, and radical, ultra-nationalist politicians were rising to power. The nation's military leaders were desperate to find new ways to secure resources and maintain control. For Ishii, the timing couldn't have been more perfect. He presented his ideas to the War Ministry with fervor, pushing for the establishment of a new institute dedicated to biological warfare research. Ishii argued that while the rest of the world might talk of peace, secret biological weapons development was happening behind closed doors. He was convinced that Japan needed to be ahead of the curve, not just in defense, but in offense. Manchuria, a playground for atrocities. With Japan's invasion and occupation of Manchuria in 1931, Ishii found the perfect testing ground for his experiments. The sparsely populated, resource-rich region offered everything he needed: space, secrecy, and a population that the Japanese colonial powers saw as expendable. In 1932, under the guise of epidemic prevention, Ishii and his team began their experiments on biological warfare. But the plague, typhus, and anthrax they studied were not merely theoretical threats, they were real, and they needed to be tested on real human subjects. What started as small-scale experiments soon turned into something far more sinister. In 1936, with the full backing of Emperor Hirohito, Ishii's institute expanded exponentially, becoming a sprawling network of secret laboratories and camps, with Unit 731 at its heart. The unspeakable horrors inside Unit 731. The prisoners who were transported to Unit 731 were stripped of their humanity the moment they arrived. Their names were replaced with numbers. They were no longer individuals but living test subjects, destined for unimaginable suffering. Bandits, guerrilla fighters, dissidents, intellectuals. Anyone the Japanese deemed undesirable was sent to the camps. For most prisoners, life inside Unit 731 lasted less than a month. They were subjected to horrific experiments designed to push the human body to its limits and beyond. Prisoners were deliberately infected with diseases like the plague and cholera, only to be dissected alive without anesthesia to observe how the diseases ravaged their organs. A death factory at war. When Japan entered World War II, Unit 731's role became even more critical. Ishii and his team ramped up their production of biological weapons. Division 4 of Unit 731 was tasked with creating lethal bacteria by the ton: cholera, anthrax, typhus, each more deadly than the last. The unit tested these weapons on live prisoners, tying them to stakes and bombing them with bacterial bombs. Fleas infected with plague were released into Chinese villages, contaminating water supplies and killing countless civilians. The final days, a desperate cover-up. As World War II came to a close and the Allies advanced, Japan's leaders realized that their defeat was inevitable. In a frantic attempt to cover up the atrocities, Unit 731 began destroying evidence. Buildings were blown up, documents were burned, and prisoners were executed. Thousands of infected animals were released into the wild, causing epidemics that ravaged the local population long after the war ended. By the time Japan officially surrendered in August 1945, Unit 731 had left behind a trail of death that spanned the globe. The aftermath: a deal with the devil. In the chaos following Japan's surrender, Ishii and his top officers fled back to Japan, where they prepared to face the consequences of their actions. But instead of standing trial for war crimes, they were offered immunity by the United States. The Cold War was looming, and the U.S. saw the data from Unit 731's experiments as too valuable to pass up. Ishii offered the U.S. a deal. In exchange for his research, he and his colleagues would avoid prosecution. The U.S. agreed, and Ishii lived out the rest of his life in peace, attending reunions with his former Unit 731 colleagues who, like him, escaped justice.